Connecting to a cloud server. Okay, recording. Okay, good morning, everybody. It is May 7th. Welcome to the Agricultural and Ecosystems Subcommittee meeting today. I'm flying solo. Bear with me. I'm terrible at running meetings, as I'm sure you all know. So first things first, approval of agenda and last week's minutes. Is there any commentary on either one of those things? I'm down for like general thumbs up, thumbs down. Cool. So next we can jump into our, quick task lead report outs. I am totally spacing on Ryan, do you want to jump in?
Sure.
We'll start in the middle and work our way out this time.
Sure. Task 5C, subtask group 5C met yesterday morning, and we dug a bit deeper into the conversation that we started the week prior around buckets, thinking higher level about strategies that have the potential to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions from the agricultural sector, while really digging into the co-benefit discussion, as well as trying to center the sustainability discussion we had as a full subcommittee last week at this time. In service of doing that, we've prepared a Excel spreadsheet which seeks to pull together the National NRCS Conservation Practice Physical Effects Assessment, which is a directional ranking of their 130 different conservation practices for soil, water, animals, plants, and humans, for which we can pull out a number of different categories, looking at greenhouse gas emissions to aquatic or terrestrial habitat, and it provides some directionality as to how federal cost share programs understand different conservation practices to benefit different resource concerns or natural resources. And the group had a discussion, and in service of trying to weed out some of those practices which may not be relevant to Vermont, just based on our geography and soils and farming, we are going to take a first cut of sorting based on the charge of the subtask group, which is the emissions reduction component. And then we'll have a ranking and then a discussion looking to highlight how those practices fit into the strategies and goals that we've been discussing the past two meetings, and then further vetting and digging into the co-benefit questions that we're very interested in evaluating, while trying to also engage in the sustainability questions that were raised. And so that spreadsheet's been prepared, and we'll be sharing it with the subtask group and looking to enter into that discussion around specific practices and their potential benefits and co-benefits next week.
Thank you for that update. Does anybody have any questions for Ryan or that group more broadly based on anything that he has shared? Cool. Let's see.
May I ask a question?
Okay. Yeah, of course.
Hey, Ryan, with respect to ag emissions, is it still the thought process that AAFM will share documents with ANR so that we can have a sort of cross-collaboration conversation around the inventory?
Yes, it's on me. I have not done that yet. The goal is Monday or Tuesday to get that over. I just reached out to Colin so we can try to have that first review next week would be our goal.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Lauren, do you want to report out for nature-based?
I might actually ask to go after task 5E, because we've largely just taken the really great spreadsheet that Charlie created for 5E into our own conversation. So maybe you all go first, and credit to Charlie, not me.
Charlie, since I have to run the meeting, can I delegate the task lead report out to you? Since you did that on the big spreadsheet.
Yeah, I mean, there's not much to report out other than we're just trying to basically organize a whole jumble of thoughts and ideas into something that's got a little bit more kind of a framework and flow to it, so we can kind of tease out what we want to pursue and then what might actually be better suited for other task groups and where the crossover is. So that's where we're at now.
Jane says she has a report for Billy. Do you want to share that?
Sure. Billy just asked me during this component to remind that you guys have, for the natural storage and sequestration task leads, it's been challenging to schedule. And he thinks he found a date, but he hasn't heard back from his team. So he just asked me to remind Judy, David, and Charlie that the meeting is on 5/11 at 10 a.m. And he's hoping that works for everybody.
Okay. Lauren? Sorry. I was a waitress for years. See what I did there?
Thank you. So the Nature-Based Solutions team met again on Tuesday. We had another good series of conversations. Largely realized that I shared my screen and showed the great spreadsheet that Charlie had created as far as, kind of capturing our work, and also there's a lot of overlap between task 5D and 5E. So kind of took it, adapted it a bit to our group, and we've now kind of not gone rogue. We're essentially breaking out and kind of identifying who's kind of going to be developing different programs, solutions, strategies, et cetera, and the different buckets and nature-based solutions groups. So we've got like rivers and floodplains and wetlands, forests, ag systems. There are a handful of others that I'm going to forget now, TEK, the built environment, and recognize that there's a lot of overlap. So we're developing those in the absence of any work from our newly contracted public engagement consultants, who we're hoping to hear from hopefully soon. We also are kind of now within our task, bringing out those conversations outside of our task group within our respective personal, professional, peer networks, and kind of getting feedback from other people, since we recognize that the 6 of us, or whatever our team might be, is, thanks Jane, I'd love to get your thoughts on wetlands, is not going to be sufficient to develop a truly comprehensive nature-based solution strategy. So we're kind of making sure that we're broadening our efforts and hope to hear more from the public engagement folks soon, so that we can do it beyond just our known networks and access people who don't typically know about these different processes.
That's great. I believe it is going to be set for the agenda next week that we will have an hour from Climate Access and RISE to start to talk about what those, how that looks moving forward. Is that everybody? Right? The carbon inventory is like a separate piece. Okay. All right, Jane. Oh, no, I apologize. Iris, did you want to give a quick report out from Just Transitions? Also, I'm going to pass along a link to a wonderful commentary that Iris wrote for Vermont Digger this week that I think everybody should take a read. And appreciation to you, Iris, for putting that out there. And if you have anything to share from Just Transitions, that would be great.
Thank you. We had a good meeting yesterday, a lot of discussion of the guiding principles. We also had a really good, which I would really suggest everyone go back and watch, just because I think that's really important. But as far as the guiding principles, we are working on it and hoping to get them out soon. But we looked into what impacted communities are and who they are, and we are looking to create like a definition of why people are impacted and like what an impacted community is, and then under that some real specific impacted communities, so people can have those in their mind when they're talking about these policies. And then we also discussed having questions for people to ask when they're doing policies. We are going to have a meeting of some people so that we can get those more fleshed out. And then we are still working on making sure that the document that we put together for like principles is in line with what we want it to look like. So yeah, I don't know if Jane has any other updates from that, but
I'll just say last night's meeting was really powerful and really productive. So I really do encourage folks, if you're interested in that component of the work, which this committee really seems to be, to encourage you to watch the video, and that there's a lot of movement. And this afternoon, a core group is meeting again to make movement on the principles and those questions. And it's great to see the action in that subcommittee right now.
That is great. I know it's on my list of things to do to go back and watch it. I apologize I couldn't join yesterday. It's a tough time slot with my kids' baseball schedule at the moment, but I'm looking forward to going back and reviewing it. Jane, let's see. Want to give us an update on the climate action plan and where everything stands with that?
On the draft,
Yes.
is that okay? I'm sorry, I don't have the agenda open.
Climate action plan timeline.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of moving pieces, and so maybe most helpful is that at the steering committee, which I believe I reported on last week, there was a need, which I spoke to identify sort of the driving factors of what we will and won't know by December 1st, and then to begin to do outreach with legislators and in anticipation of recognition that while they don't approve the climate action plan, they need to be in support of what we will or won't be accomplishing by December 1st. So I've had tireless conversations this week with many people who have ideas about that, and that will be first and foremost on the steering committee meeting agenda for this coming Monday. And perhaps that's what I want to highlight most for all of you is I've shared this with you all in email form, but just so you are fully aware, the steering committee is now meeting bi-weekly on Mondays on the off month, like the off bi weeks of the council. And that was shifted to accommodate the majority of co-chairs to attend those meetings as a touch point for co-chairs to coordinate and identify issues of need for collaboration, discuss milestones, stumbling blocks. And so this Monday will be that first coordinating meeting with co-chairs joining. We'll spend the beginning of the meeting discussing that timeline, because I really do think that timeline and our decision around what we can and can't do by December 1st influences the milestones and all of your work at the subcommittee level the most, obviously. And so, and then we'll sort of move into a conversation with the co-chairs after that, where the co-chairs will be asked to answer two sort of simple-ish but similar questions around identifying one or two areas in need of coordination from what you're seeing from your work with other subcommittees, and then to speak to what is appearing to be July as the major milestone for the first suite of strategies and recommendations to be put up and out from the subcommittees to come up to the council to then be vetted through a thoughtful public engagement process over the summer and into the fall. And so that's what Monday will be. I'll ask all of you, the draft of the climate action plan itself, besides the moving pieces of the timeline, I suspect it still needs some work around your work group, around the subcommittee, and how we frame the issues under sequestration in particular, and what the headings are. And I'm not prepared to do that today, but maybe a number of us could do that offline at some point and then bring it back to the subcommittee, the full subcommittee at another time. I've been too focused on the timeline this week, as well as some other issues that have come up. So I encourage folks to, and I'll just say that we shifted Monday for that steering committee meeting in hopes of other council members being able to join, and we encourage participation from other council members, subcommittee members, because we knew Mondays worked as a council meeting, and we hoped Mondays would then be somewhat available for council members to sit in on the steering committee meetings. So thanks. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? Jane? Wanting to just quickly say, hello, Jake, welcome back. Want to give you a moment to share anything if you want to share anything. If not, that's cool too.
Yeah, sure. I think Carmen will appreciate at some point in her life that her birth was memorialized on a public recorded meeting. So our second daughter, Carmen Elizabeth Claro, was born on Saturday, April 24th, and mom and baby are healthy. It was a great injection of joy into our lives, certainly in this very tumultuous past year. So just, yeah, really feeling optimistic and recharged about this work that we're doing here. So takes on definitely new import for sure. Yeah, sleep so far has been pretty good. But we'll see how that goes in the coming weeks here. So, yep, feeling good and everyone's doing well. So thank you, everyone.
That
And
is,
thanks, Abby.
that is so wonderful. Welcome, Earthside Carmen. We're all so happy you're here. Hey, man, there is nothing like that to uplift, Thank you for sharing, Jake. Okay, the next thing on my agenda is review subtask document to confirm all groups are aligned directionally and focusing recommendation at similar levels of granularity, which I signed off on last week when I did not know that Billy wasn't going to be here to guide me through whatever that means. And I don't even know if I have screen sharing capabilities. So help. Does anybody
Everybody should be able to share a screen on Zoom, I think.
okay, well, I should have
Abby, I'll share for you, but I'm not offering to facilitate. So I'll share my screen.
Okay. Anyway. Okay, so I think the thought was, oh gosh, apologies, guys. I'm like combing through the cobwebs in my brain. I believe the intent was to try to make sure that having had a few weeks under our belts with being in task groups, that to make sure that that this still felt in line with how we were moving through things, and to try to make sure that as we were eventually coming back together with things from our task groups, that we were lining up in ways that weren't going to make everything that much more complicated. Does that sound in line with what other people's memories are?
Yeah, we're returning, and as we've had a few meetings, it makes sense to see what we put down if I think it still coincides with how we're moving forward. Makes sense to me.
Okay, so task A. Okay, task B is going to be difficult to assess, I would imagine, because it's right. You guys haven't really had a chance to connect yet. Yes, Judy, go ahead.
I found this book that might relate to task A. It's all about wildlands and plant diversity. And so that number 4, that TEK in relationship to carbon budget, there's a lot of that in here. So I don't know. I'm not on that committee. I just wanted to bring it to somebody's attention.
And that's called Seeds of Restoration Success. Did I read that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe if you're willing, would you mind sending along the title and the author just to me in an email, and then I can pass that along?
Sure. They're friends of mine. They
Okay.
sent it to me. They work for the BLM.
Okay.
And yeah, it has a lot of things about plant diversity and using plant diversity to increase carbon storage.
Okay. Very cool and deeply relevant. Thank you. Do we want to move down? Lauren, do you mind scrolling down to 5C? Ryan has been so well organized that I really have no doubt that I mean, Ryan, Alyssa, David, Marley, Judson, John, anybody feeling anything, seeing this, reviewing this and in relationship to how we've been moving through things? Also, Jane is asking, is everyone aware of conservation design? I will admit I am not familiar with that specific term. So a link would be,
I'm just going to put a link. It's very pertinent to what Judy was discussing. It's sort of a roadmap to that was worked on for a number of years by private and public partners to create a conservation design for the state of Vermont to preserve ecological function and processes. It feels very pertinent to this group as sort of a roadmap around design and ecological function. It gets at all the components of wetlands, rivers, forests, connectivity. I'll just put it here.
okay. Cool.
Abby, just as I look at the task 5C list, I'm not sure that our group has yet really tackled the traditional ecological knowledge piece. So that's a good reminder to see that. I think we'll need to bring that back up and make sure we're building that into our work plan.
Absolutely. Thank you for flagging that.
That group have any part of their work plan that's cross collaborating with the cross sector mitigation, who has their they have a non-energy emissions, which is largely ag emissions conversation. I know there's so much opportunity for collaboration, but also redundancy there, and it not being put in there. I wonder how that's being managed, if at all.
Maybe that is something that should be added into that. Ryan, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm working to participate in those conversations, and I know Diane is participating in that subcommittee staff support, and so we're working to ensure we're not duplicating work. And as I understand the workflow, I think most of the investigation into the specific ag gross and net emissions discussion is happening within this group, and then we'll be reporting out for review vetting discussion within that other subtask group, and a recommendation from that subcommittee ultimately on that ag emissions component. So I think there's good coordination happening at this point, but definitely does not hurt to call that out as a need as we move along and perhaps arrive at a space where a recommendation could be shared. I don't think we're there yet.
All right, 5D. How's that feeling?
Judy, John, Jake, Allie, if she's here. Anybody have any thoughts?
I guess the other thing I'm willing to do, because this seems is, is this where we want to be spending time today, or do we feel like this is not the best use of our time today? Do we feel like reviewing this is unnecessary at this juncture?
Abby, I was just going to say that I think reviewing this in conjunction with the updates that were provided earlier makes a lot of sense. Just like then we have this as a reference point to maybe identify like where like in that update where it fits in kind of the steps that this kind of like rough work plan outlines. Because I was just going to say that I think from the update that was provided for 5D that, you know, we're kind of in this space of like between 2 and 3, like we now have a spreadsheet and a format to start doing the inventorying process. Yeah, so we're kind of like at number 3, it feels like, and the other identified things 4, 5, 6, and 7 all still seem relevant, but we're just not, I don't think we're sort of have quite progressed to that stage yet.
Okay, great. Thank you. Allie, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I was just gonna say one discussion we had at the Natural Solutions, Climate Solutions group is recognizing, I think Lauren kind of touched on this earlier, recognizing there's a lot of overlap between the task groups. So if there's a way to share a static list that each group has, especially for existing programs, we saw, so Charlie had made this great list for task E, and his forestry background. I looked at that. Those are a lot of the same existing programs I would put for sequestration and nature-based solutions, but there might be subtle tweaks for each of those tasks within those existing programs. So it might be just like, we were just thinking, instead of each group reinventing the wheel, is there a way we can share a static, not editable document between the groups so that we can start and also have the same framework somewhat, across, if we're thinking about the same things. I think Jake had a good suggestion too, within that kind of flagging. Are there programs that are being discussed right now in the legislature that we might opportunistically be able to tag on to, right? Thinking about, is there something we could tweak something currently that exists or is has been attempted to be tweaked in the past? Are there versus coming up with a new program? So kind of identifying things that exist and could be tweaked versus new programs. So those were 2 suggestions I thought were help maybe facilitate this process a little bit amongst the tasks.
And just to tag on to that, we sort of all took an area we might share documents with everybody in the committee. And John sent one really interesting one about wool that I would have never thought about. And I shared a chapter in this book with Lauren because I'm so digitally challenged. I'm not sure how to get it all to everybody on the other email address. So, but we're trying, and some of the articles are amazing, and there's so many different perspectives that people are coming from. I think that will help to increase the inventory of things that we need to consider, right where Jake said we are, number 3.
That is great. Any other thinking on 5D? All right. Warren, do you mind scrolling down to 5E? Again, I sense that we are particularly having had the structure that Charlie provided moving along well in relationship to these questions and priorities, but I'm happy to have Lauren or Jake or Charlie or Alyssa add any thoughts that they have.
I have just a quick little comment, Abby.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm participating in task 5E and 5. What are we? B or C, both of the ag focused ones. And I have noticed that the organization of our thought process is kind of opposite. The spreadsheet that we're working on in 5E starts with strategies, initiatives, and programs, and then kind of identifies which pieces of the puzzle they hit. And then the other group that I'm on really started with practices and like actual like changes on the landscape, and then moving towards yeah, they're just like very different approaches. And I think that we might get to the same place, but I just wanted folks to keep in mind that as we work from these different logic models towards, you know, getting to the recommendations, that keeping in touch about what those things look like and how they get shared and written up, and getting them aligned at some point makes sense. You're on both of those groups too, Abby, so you know this, right?
I do.
I haven't seen the spreadsheets or the documents from the other groups though, and so I just be curious if is it clear that like the majority are starting with the initiatives and programs, or the other way?
I guess I don't know that I know the answer to that question, so I'm happy to have anybody else shed light on that. This structuring work in these ways is not my forte, clearly. So as you pointed out, you know, like the task group that I'm leading is coming at things from a very different way than the other task group in which I am. And so I guess maybe that's a question for everybody, you know, how, to Billy's point on here about granularity and being aligned directionally and things like that, you know, at what point or in what way are we going to put these structures together?
Yeah,
that makes sense and move us towards the broader goal of coming up with our slate of strategies, etc.
Abby, my experience with this kind of work is that we can only get so far on the abstract, and at some level, what we just have to do is start throwing a bunch of ideas up on there and then start sorting them. And I think this conversation will make a lot more sense to all of us once we've got a bunch of ideas and we're saying, all right, well, that's a theme. Let's make that's a theme. That's an overarching theme that's worked into everything. And this is something that's, you know, a concrete idea that fits in this bucket. And this is a more important future question that we need to deal with later. Or here's a cross-cutting, you know, like, for instance, I think as Alyssa is going to suggest, there's a whole set of cross-cutting themes, like, you know, land conversion cuts across a number of these areas. And I think, you know, the ag and forest areas both need to confront what is that? How do we deal with that? Is that a set of regulatory tools? Is it a set of public incentives, tax incentives? You know, economic investments? I think those things will start to become a little clearer as we just get ideas thrown up on the board for what it's worth.
Lauren?
Yeah, I guess I would just use this opportunity to re-elevate what Allie brought up earlier. I saw a lot of nodding when she said, is there a way to share static versions so we're not creating a collaborative document outside of the public eye, but that so we have a little bit more visibility on what's going on within each of the subcommittee or the task conversations. That's probably really helpful. And like David said, people are just starting to throw ideas into our different digital spreadsheets and having greater visibility on how they're creating that work and seeing opportunities for collaboration and reducing redundancy. I feel like that's the best way. And we all nodded, but didn't really come to any like actual agreement on if that's possible. So maybe I'll just ask Jane if that's something that we can do, is to share static versions with each other.
I don't think I can answer that in a clear way right now.
Okay.
But I will say that I've been thinking a lot about this. We've met a few times internally to think about document sharing, and I think that it's okay if you share it, and others can check me on this who I know on this subcommittee who have experience in our agency with this kind of stuff at a higher level than me. But I think it's okay to share once with all of you and share that document as long as it's then added and supported on the website with the agenda. So whatever you've shared as a document will ultimately need to get posted as a living document on the website is the way I've been treating that. So okay to share once in an email, can't reply all, and just can't make any edits via the email. And then as long as I'm copied on that, I can sort of make sure that they're made available to the public as a supporting document on the ag. But it becomes awkward putting so many drafts up on the web, and that's what it feels funny to me right now, but that's what we have been doing. So sorry it's not clear. It's hard.
Are we, does everybody feel okay with this document? So Lauren should stop screen sharing, or do we want to keep this up for a bit more? Cool.
I answered that question.
So Charlie, sorry, I didn't see your hand.
That's okay. Just put it up. I just had a question. I don't know if we discussed this or not, but do we have a timeline for kind of like when, like the way I'm seeing this is that each group does their work. We get to a place where we're like, okay, our spreadsheet looks good. And then maybe there's like a coordinating committee from this group that kind of combines them all for reflection or something like that. But I know that everyone on the call has like a billion things happening in their lives and with their work. And I tend to like meet a deadline. So do we have like a date by which we're hoping like each of the task groups will have a 90% deliverable done that could then be rolled into something? And I just want to avoid like getting to say sometime in June and all of a sudden being like, oh crap, this is due next week, and everybody trying to scramble at once.
Let's see. Jane says we need to have a complete suite of strategies and recommendations by July. So I assume that is our entire subcommittee needs to have that suite done, which I would assume means that our task groups in theory would want to have a fairly complete skeleton sketched out by the end of May.
Yeah, it seems like
I'm going to backpedal just as you go ahead, Charlie.
Sorry, go ahead, Jane.
I was just going to backpedal about recommendations and how much specificity. We want to have a complete suite of all the buckets of strategies by July. Whether that includes all the recommendations, I don't think that's actually necessary. So I was just backpedaling on the amount of specificity there. But the idea would be that we would go out and test the full suite of strategies at a high level starting in mid-July through August and September. And then that would all come back in while you were still making progress on recommendations, and then be complemented with the economic information that we'll have starting at the end of the summer.
I think part of personally what my hesitancy is in trying to put together any dates in this meeting is that we haven't had the time with RISE and climate access yet, and we don't have guiding principles from Just Transitions. And I'm aware of how much time and energy has gone into trying to talk about, not crafting too much before we've had some public engagement to make sure that we're not getting ahead of ourselves. And so I will admit that is the sort of internal tension I'm feeling as to like how far down the path do we go without having done the first, without having done public engagement with, particularly to Iris's point about impacted communities, and not wanting to go into those communities and say, here's what we've been thinking for you, and so that's the tension that I'm feeling at the moment. And I will freely admit that I do not know precisely how to navigate that, or what the best way is, or how to answer the dates question, for example, because I don't really think we know. So,
Maybe I'd like to offer a suggestion.
please.
And I feel like you this week, Abby. This has been like a doozy of a week, so I feel a little abstract myself right now. But I do just want to suggest that on Monday there'll be more clarity, is my anticipation, from the steering committee around timeline and deliverables. In our conversations with Climate Access and RISE, my expectation is that that first component of their public engagement around framing the issues in order to inform strategies and recommendations, that's starting now, and that's been sort of ongoing a bit now, and they're coming to the subcommittees for input on that next week. Through that conversation, they'll explain their whole proposal with you, the different components of the engagement and outreach, the touch points with the subcommittees next week. And I think that maybe, Abby, you, Billy, and I work on the agenda for next week that then allows that to flow into a conversation about milestones, so that because I think Charlie's right, that there needs to be discrete deadlines for the task leads, at recognizing that all that work has to come back to the subcommittee and be vetted and compiled in a thoughtful process. And then the anticipation is that it would be bucketed up for the council either at the end of June, the council meeting likely, or at the steering committee co-chair meeting in early mid-July. So yeah, it's coming fast and furious, and what that means. And so I think we could be more prepared next week to have that conversation. But I will say that, and Iris, you can check me, I know that the guiding principles originally, Just Transitions had hoped they would be done by the end of April, pretty on task. So it feels like in the next 2 weeks that those are, I think that's the sort of goal, to have that draft, but they'll need input and more work too. But there will be a draft in 2 weeks of those. And I know it's like a chicken and egg thing with that framing engagement that Climate Access and RISE is going to do now, not wanting to go too far into strategy development without hearing from the public. But we just have to think of it as a co-creation iterative process, and that is happening now. You will get that information in June, and then you can inform any of the strategies that you're thinking about at that point based on what you hear from the public, and hopefully put it all together pretty quickly.
Thanks, Jane. Judy?
Is there any goals or criteria or questions when you're talking with the public that you're interested in? Here's why. Lauren and I are going to do a presentation with the middle school at the middle school institution in hopes of getting middle school teachers and their students interested in following some of these meetings and paying attention to what's happening. I also got another invitation, and I'm not really sure about guidelines or what it is you want out there. But I guess what I'm saying is public interaction is something that people's interested in, and at some level, I'm feeling like I could participate in that a bit. So I don't know if you have guidelines on that or specific talking points or questions or whatever.
That's great. And Judy, I appreciate that. And another council member I was speaking with yesterday really talked about how she doesn't like it being called phase 1 of public engagement that we're about to start on with the contractors, because really there's been components of public engagement and outreach happening from all of you and others since the enaction of the Global Warming Solutions Act, and they'll continue to be those touch points as they should be with council members and beyond. And so there's also been an ask and an interest to have talking points to use with legislators and I think in general communication. And yes, that's something we're working on. And I think it's great to do outreach and engagement, especially with different age groups and different backgrounds. And so, yes, hopefully that will be forthcoming talking points. But right now it's been like an all hands on deck around sort of the deliverable and thinking about how we need to advance the sort of state buy-in around the December 1st date. But that's part of the communication effort too, I think.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you for that.
If there is nothing else from anybody at the moment, this does provide a fairly clever segue into our public comment, seeing as how we're talking about public engagement. So if there are members of the public that want to add anything for our perspectives at this point, that would be wonderful. If you want to just put your hands up or jump in. Okay. Oh, Jennifer Ramstetter, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much. I wanted to say two things. One is with regard to the public engagement. Again, I've said this before, I really am so impressed with the ability of the public to attend these meetings and all the resources that are on the website. And I really wonder if it could be productive for there to be more awareness of that ability, because I think it's just an excellent opportunity. I haven't taken full advantage of it, but I think it's an excellent opportunity for the public to be engaged all the way along. And I think that that's going to go a long way in terms of our climate solutions and just transitions. So I really think that's a great opportunity. The other thing I wanted to say is I get so enlivened when I come to these meetings and when I read the resources that are there, that becomes balanced by knowledge of hundreds, if not thousands of acres of forest land and likely some farmland as well, although I'm less aware of that, that's changed hands just in the last year in Windham County. And over the past 5 years, Bennington County, Rutland County, and we don't know what's going to happen to that forested land. So on the one hand, I'm really excited what's happening here in this subcommittee and the Vermont Climate Council as a whole. And yet I feel this urgency that we need to have strategies. I know of a forestry management plan that's being enacted on the Green Mountain National Forest. So in addition to private lands, and I would say it's not a forest management plan which is productive in terms of ameliorating climate change. So I just wanted to throw those things out, and I know there aren't any answers to that, but wanted to express it. Thank you.
Two questions for you. One, are the pieces that you're feeling like you wish were more broadly known are the ability to attend public meetings and the public portal? So maybe whether it's trying to share those more broadly through social media or posting them in online papers, things like that, is there sort of more of a media strategy that could be tied into sharing out those methods of engagement?
Yes, I think that would be great. I do worry that it doesn't provide equal access for everyone, but it would provide greater access than there is now. And how many people would take advantage of that? I don't really know. but I think it would, I've been involved in a lot of processes where people end up feeling it's a done deal. And that's not necessarily the case, and it's certainly not the case here. There's a lot of opportunity for influence and engagement, but I don't think people are really aware of that. I don't think most people are. You know, there's certainly, in the meetings I've attended, there's certainly have been a number of members of the public, which is great. But it's a handful.
Yeah, that is true, and something I appreciate that. We'll try to get that into some higher level thinking about maybe how to market the ability to engage with the process.
Which is what I'm trying to promote with the Middle School Institute. So there'll be over 100 middle school teachers at this institute. And if they can bring this back to their classrooms and share some of this with their students, that would be great.
Absolutely. John?
I've shared, with the people like the Vermont Soil Health Network. I've tried to share the public portal. I've also told farmers, dairy farmers or any kind of farmer that I work with, they can email me. I will comment that, and Jane may be able to explain this to me, but when you go on the Vermont Climate Council website, which is part of the Agency of Administration website, right? There isn't actually a button. I'm not quite sure why there isn't a button that says public participation, which make it with so much more obvious and easy to me, and maybe to others. And there may be a very good reason why it is this separate link, but it just might make it easier for everybody if it was simpler.
Okay. The other thing I wanted to say, Jennifer, is certainly being down here in Windham County myself, the land transition is something that keeps me awake at night. So I don't have any answers except to tell you that it's high on my mind, and I have the same really deep concerns that we're too late and that some of these things are underway. I don't have an answer to that. I was noticing last night all of the logging that's being done down here in conjunction with somebody telling me at some point in the last week that southern Vermont actually has massive sequestration potential in its forests at the moment, versus the understanding that it's actually in the Northeast Kingdom that's most happening. I cannot remember where that information came from or from whom I heard it, but I did hear it. And so I don't have any answer, but it is factoring into the thinking that I'm doing, at least. And I think, as with anything else, the more awareness that's brought to that, and maybe that's something we do need to add into our thinking. What are the trains that have already left the station, if you will, and what are we missing in just thinking forward versus assessing what's happening literally on the ground at the moment, which is not, as you point out, working in a beneficial direction to climate action. So thank you for bringing that forward, and we'll try to keep it factored in, certainly.
Thank you. I wanted to mention the Open Space Institute has a lot of funding, which is going to Northern Appalachian region, which a part of Vermont is in. So there are a lot of forested regions within Vermont, including southeastern Vermont, which fall into their priority category. So it may be that kind of map that you've seen.
Yeah, that is possible.
I'll try to post that.
That would be great. Thank you so much.
That'll be my
Make another comment.
Yes, of course.
This is Paul Bruja again up in Sutton, Vermont, and I came from a resource background working with the U.S. Forest Service, and I was specifically Director of Strategic Planning and Resource Assessment during my last 6 years in the agency before I retired. And I would suggest that if there are concerns about the sustainable planning and sustainable management of the Green Mountain National Forest, that you engage maybe the forest supervisor and Ms. Ramstead, you can put them right on the spot. That's what they're there for. They're public servants.
Thank you for that. It's true. If there are no more comments from the public, which it looks like there are not, looks like we're slated to turn to a discussion of our beloved MCA tool. I don't know, Lauren, if you're willing to share your screen, or if people think that is of benefit to them to have the screen shared with the MCA tool, or whether we want to just dive into a discussion. All right, let's go for that screen share.
You sound so excited about it, Abby. I have to say your enthusiasm is really getting us energized for the second half of our meeting. Before I do screen share, based on listening to the meeting from several weeks ago, I sent around an updated version. There are some lingering questions. I'm really excited that Iris is here and that the Just Transition Subcommittee talked a bit more about how we define impacted communities, because that was a big part of our conversation in the subcommittee. So that is an outstanding part of this that still needs some tweaking. There are a couple of other opportunities for shared definitions that I think would be good just to make part of this tool in general. So there's the actual matrix that we go through as each of our tasks build out the strategies, and that at the bottom of it, there's that shared definition and the recognition of the equity imperative in the work. That there are a couple of parts on the MCA that talk about equity, but that there's a need to incorporate equity in each of those individual things. And I put an example in there, like air quality. If you're saying that there's directionality and a different strategy that says, we think this is a positive impact on air quality. Is it a positive impact on air quality for all Vermonters? Needs to be, as an example, one of the questions, but we can get to that point when we get there. And I would certainly say, if there's any additional feedback, now is certainly the time to be making, I hope, final edits to this. And I guess anything, especially from Alyssa or David, before I start screen sharing. Nothing from David. Thumbs up from Alyssa. Okay. Are you all seeing it?
Yes.
So we can either walk through the questions that I have, kind of that lingering questions for updating this, and or we could walk through with another example strategy. I wasn't part of agenda development this week, so I'm not entirely sure what the next 30 minutes could or should look like, or what you all think is the best way to approach this.
I'm, in theory, was part of agenda development, but will admit that I have no grand thoughts on that. But thank you for calling that out so specifically, my dear.
You're welcome.
Alyssa says, let's look at the outstanding questions. I think that makes the most sense. So
okay,
dive into those.
I'll have to click through each of them then. Some of them are not outstanding questions, but guidance questions for when people walk through, like this one, for example, climate resilience. Does the proposed strategy help build climate resilience to whatever each of these sub-criteria are? So that was a question that came up several times during this group's conversation a couple of weeks ago. So just leaving that in there as a kind of breadcrumb as each of us have our respective conversations. There was a conversation around what storm looks like and the issue of potential double counting. An example would be that we have flood damage described elsewhere and then storm hazards here. So that would be what I would consider to be a lingering question for us to answer potentially now, what we mean by storm and if that should be changed or if we should fold that into the extreme precipitation events and flooding. Any thoughts?
Well, just a quick observation that doesn't really answer the question of whether we should combine them or not. But I was thinking when we first used that terminology of, ice storms, extreme cold weather or tornadoes, or I don't know what might befall Vermont over the coming years as a result of climate change. But I was thinking of things distinct from flooding, but it may make sense to merge it into a set of extreme weather events.
I think at one point, I think we talked about kind of, and this is where my terminology might be wrong, but like stochastic events versus longer term, like a storm event versus gradually increasing temperatures leading to greater drought persistency. So maybe we could bucket them in terms of like an event that happens at a defined time frame that impacts the area, environment, whatever factors, versus longer term changes we're seeing in the environment that are like persistent. I don't know how you would include more flooding over a longer time, though. That would be a tough one.
Right.
And Lauren, excuse me, Lauren, is there any reason to differentiate between risks and hazards? They're different things. And in the climate, the definition of the two, what's the risk of a storm event as opposed to, what?
Hazards from?
Hazards, hazards denote the anticipated cause of a harm, whereas risks denote the anticipation of a harm. I'm afraid I sort of have gotten into this a little bit recently because of dealing with questions about herbicide use and how scientists or the EPA measure and rate herbicides. And so the idea of differentiating between risks and hazards is, I'm just posing the question. If everybody thinks it's one and the same and we don't need to worry about it, that's fine with me. I'm just curious.
I guess my default response is similar to David's, which is thinking of an actual example. Does it make sense to call out specifically risks and then hazards? Then you get into vulnerabilities too, and each of those three different buckets of how you can approach just one single like flood event. So I guess I would ask you, John, since you seem to be doing it a bit more, if you think that is applicable here as we run through different strategies. Does it make sense to run a strategy against a risk versus a hazard, or for the group at large?
I guess I'll have to think about that a little more, Lauren.
Okay.
I take your point though, John. I think it's one of those things that I think David has alluded to that's really tricky with this, right? Is that particularly when you're dealing with thoughtful people who look at language closely, right? Like they do mean different things and they do have different, they have different meanings, and therefore, like, if we're questioning, if we're trying to do work in a thoughtful way that questions assumptions and things like that, then, specifically identifying what we mean by those types of words is really critical. And also, I think, as David has alluded to, can weigh us down sometimes in the process by getting so deep into the semantics of something that we're, not seeing the forest for the trees. But I'm not really sure, in regards to those specific words, where we fall, it could be worth calling out just the same way that it does in the GWSA as to adaptation, resilience, mitigation, et cetera, and the definitions that the law uses for each of those words. You know, we could do a similar thing for risk, hazard, and vulnerability if we feel like it serves us better to do so, or allows for a more a fuller conversation about the implications of different things. But I'm not sure how everybody is, you know, where everybody's at in regards to that.
Well,
David?
just a thought for how to proceed process-wise might be, again, I know this is a broken record, but sometimes just having a concrete example answers the questions. And I suspect that, you know, for instance, like both John's point and the point that Charlie were making could be things that we have, you know, a little definitions page at the back end that just clarifies. When we're talking about storms, we mean this. And by the way, we framed it this way in terms of hazard versus risk, you know, and recognize there's some flaws with it, and just kind of footnote or capture the places where there's ambiguities, and then make sure as we go through and apply the criteria that we're being intentional about it. So I'm thinking about something that like an extreme weather event that's not flooding, that might have a public policy associated with it. Like we want to move power lines out of forests because they're more vulnerable to fires or ice storms and to power disruptions. And that might intersect with the work of the energy group to kind of create more localized energy grids that are more resilient. So there'd be kind of a double benefit in there. And then we would just ask the question, where does that fit in here? Is that, is that about forests? And do we already count forest benefits somewhere else? Or is that really about energy? And did we count that somewhere else? But I just, for my own part, I get a little lost in the theory in the absence of having a concrete example to work through.
Yeah.
Alyssa.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I'll help make this list, and I think I tried to be inclusive of all the direct and indirect impacts of climate change, and I think severe wind, when I added storm hazard, it was just to make sure that we didn't forget to consider other things that might be associated with storms that maybe I wasn't thinking of at the time. So we could take it out. But as we go through this, remember, it's just a tool to make sure that we're not forgetting to consider things. And I think worrying about terms too much, maybe getting us away from the way that we're going to use this, which is it's just to make sure that we're not forgetting to account for all of these different considerations. And so if it's a problematic to have the term hazard in, we could take it out, but I just want to make sure that we include everything, right? That so that's just some background on when I made the list, but I'm okay with changing it in whatever way folks want to. It could be just severe wind. Maybe that's easy.
I think Jake wants to add something.
Yeah. Now I'm like processing also what
the
Alyssa just
hands
said.
on my. I'm
No,
sorry,
I didn't raise a hand. I unmuted and then I was sort of like looking like I had something to say. I feel like the use of the term severe in conjunction with hazards here implies like a certain type of risk that's posed by, like it's not, it's not any hazard, perspective hazard. It's a hazard of a particular degree which poses significant risk. So I like, there is a problem with getting too far into the semantics, but it is important that we at least understand like what's implied by that term, the terminology that's being used there. So that's just the way that I see it, as kind of the severe is qualifying it in a way that I think captures the notion of risk.
That makes sense. I'm trying to go over it and think of it in terms of, oh, Sonia added, maybe split each storm out. You've already split out quite a few: increased fire risks, increased risk of severe wind events, increased risk of extreme temperature events, other climate risks not captured above, or try to find different ways to combine them. Or are we at a point where this is a guideline tool, to Alyssa's point, and we're all, I think, thoughtful, responsible adults who are likely going to remember that we mean all of those different things, but I'm also sorry, but I'm also, whatever people are feeling most comfortable with.
I would support Alyssa's comment, and then maybe just say to elevate Jake's as well. I put in this, you all would have seen because you can see my screen, potentially just adding other non-flood storms, so we're not double counting, but that makes sure that we're getting both severe weather events and then the more stochastic events like increased pest disease and weed pressure, incidents of drought, and just recognize that increased or severe wind and other non-flood storm hazards is probably sufficient. One small thing like a tornado might fall through the crack perhaps, but I think generally speaking, we're just looking for directionality through this tool to help us understand. And there's going to be at the bottom an other questions and comments section where people should, for each of the individual strategies, be able to say like, hey, this tool is missing this, or maybe we should make sure we're also considering X, Y, or Z. So I would be supportive of Alyssa and recommend perhaps for the group to agree by consensus now, just changing it to other non-flood storms. 2 thumbs up.
That makes sense to me. Judy does call out a really interesting question though, which I'm not sure how it fits in with this tool, but she asks, is there a difference when someone gets financial aid? For instance, someone that gets flooded might get relief funding, where someone that loses a tree because of strong winds might not get funding for cleanup, which is that is a fantastic question. And I'm not sure how that fits into that. That strikes me as more of a question that would be relevant within the strategy formation, or potentially called out within, would that be an equity component to call out, what are the funding, how are the funding mechanisms working for things like that? I'm not really sure.
Judy, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I don't know the answer to that. But I'm thinking of like when the state is just declared a disaster area and all this funding comes pouring in because of flooding, that is so extreme. It might be a higher point than someone where a microburst comes and plops down and takes out a row of trees. And so is there a distinguishing factor that kicks in financial aid? And if there is, could one have a higher point than the other?
Ryan? You're muted, Ryan.
Double muted, apologies. Specifics I can share in this space with regards to agriculture. As an example, Tropical Storm Irene and that disaster declaration for agricultural producers led to the Farm Service Agency and NRCS under USDA to activate their emergency restoration. No, I just had the acronym on the top of my head. Their emergency conservation program, which works to help put fields back into production. It doesn't always cover all of the gaps that are there. And there was some other private funding that was out there to help restore agricultural land that was degraded during that storm. And so that's only triggered when there's a national disaster declaration or state one where funding comes to the state, but there also are more specific drought designations that are made. But sometimes there are some administrative challenges in ensuring programs can deliver services to the affected farmers that have water supply issues for their livestock. So there are programs that are out there. It doesn't fill all the gaps, and it does take a significant event covering more than a microburst to activate them, is my understanding.
I'll put my natural hazards resilience cap on, and I could talk probably ad nauseum about federal aid, financial aid, state assistance, different thresholds. Yes, John, it is about 1 million. Judy, we can get into conversations, but it's largely based on counties. I do think, to Abby's point though, and talking about this a little bit more, that consideration really is based on the strategy and not necessarily what you'd put in the MCA. So if you're recognizing that there are gaps in financial and or state aid for different storms, and that there's an opportunity to alleviate a lot of different issues by changing that or tweaking that or recommending that we do, which is our job as a subcommittee, then that would be a strategy. And I'd be really happy to talk about those at the strategy development scale.
Judy?
Because that brings up the question then about resilience versus adaptation. And then it becomes an equity issue if people can't adapt financially. That's all. I'm just trying to bring that to the floor. That's all.
No, it's completely relevant and deeply important that we consider it. But I'm guessing that, yeah, that's something that we need to formulate more into how the strategy development is formulated versus how, well, I don't know, versus how we filter the strategy potentially through the MCA tool, but I guess I don't know where it's most effective or how it's most effective to be used.
If I could just chime in, I think that this is a great conversation, not just individually, but thinking about communities. And I apologize, my attention got diverted for a minute there on something else. But a good example of this would be, this spring, our town of Montgomery got slammed with the worst mud season anybody alive can remember. And it was due to, just rapid warm up with rain and then combinations of other things too. But just the fluctuations in climate we're seeing, it's going to happen again. And as I think John pointed out, FEMA only kicks in when there's $1 million of damage at a county level. And so we're high and dry. We've got this like $15,000 hole in our budget now. And the state basically is like, sorry, can't help you. And so this is definitely something to flag in terms of resilience for especially rural communities. And that can be defined by geography or by, culture, social, personal communities. But definitely an important thing to flag if we're going to be building resilience into our communities and having the resources in place to do that.
So thinking about that, Charlie, should the word not be storm? Should the word be weather events?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I guess weather events. Yeah, I don't know what the best word would be, but perhaps storm isn't the best event.
Or
In this case, it wasn't a storm. It was a perfect storm of factors, you know. But it's a good point to think about whether or not that's the right.
weather hazards, maybe.
Yeah.
I feel like in the course of this conversation, we're identifying a policy or programmatic recommendation here for, you know, community level sort of resilience investment that, you know, FEMA is sort of the only recourse that we have sort of in a disaster proclamation, and that there are, as you're saying, Charlie, there's sort of all these other kind of components that are coming together now that are posing real problems for municipalities and towns, and kind of revealing some budget gaps that don't kind of fit, you know, in current definitions of extreme weather or disaster relief.
And not to
Do you
derail
all think
the
it makes
MCA
sense maybe to
conversation.
add on, oh, go ahead, Charlie.
No, I was going to say that this I don't want to derail the MCA conversation we're having, but it gets at other factors too around climate change factors and impacts on operations. So another perfect storm with this thing was that that's the time of year that every sugar maker is hauling sap across back roads. And so you've got these extremely overweight ag vehicles that no town has the ability to stop, tearing up roads that make it impassable for anybody who lives on them or emergency service vehicles. So we can flag that as part of the conversation in terms of operations and the impact of operations within the framework of these changing issues that impact land, water, etc.
Might I make a recommendation then that we add, what I'm hearing is kind of a shift in conversation towards community resilience. And I wonder if community resilience should be its own little subcategory under climate resilience, that it incorporates the more human individual and community side of the conversation. And I see Jane's coming up with me too.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say that we're talking about that exact component of the rural resilience this afternoon, because that's they really only, they're focused on sort of their heading as community resilience, and defining what community means to them. And it feels like there's going to be a lot of interplay here between the work here and their work in that section. And I was about to type in the chat too that I've been thinking a lot late this week. Some things have come to my attention about how we're sort of missing the boat perhaps on some analyses that we might need with respect to resiliency planning. And we're going to talk about that this afternoon too. And I think that what I was going to suggest is that might circle back into our conversation with you all next week about like milestones and work planning a little bit more definitively around thinking about other technical analyses that are needed for the climate action plan, and thinking about vulnerability analyses and where that fits. And it probably requires a conversation between the two subcommittees. So anyway, I that heading, community resilience, is in the draft of the climate action plan, and thinking about what that captures together will be really important.
Judson wrote in the chat, isn't financial component part of the feasibility part of prioritization matrix and not this MCA? And also, are we lumping climate resilience and adaptation together in this MCA? Which are good questions. People are coming up with great questions today. I have no answers, but they're great questions.
Melissa.
Yeah, so in terms of this second question of Judson's, I would say yes, in this list it absolutely is, because it's not elsewhere. And one of the ways that we can define resilience, and is pretty common, is the capacity to absorb, respond, adapt, or transform in the face of any kind of impact or risk, like a long-term stress or a short-term shock. So yes, I would say adaptation is included in that resilience consideration from my perspective. And I think, to just my thoughts on the first question of his, is that I think the financial component is a little bit different than what the conversation has been around here, right? Isn't just kind of the cost Is that later part that's part of the prioritization matrix?
Yeah, that's more of a financial feasibility to implement the strategy. But there is, at the second half of this MCA tool does have economic considerations too. But I think to Judy's point, that's the larger economy and not necessarily the individual scale or the community scale, which brings me back to potentially recommending that under climate resilience, we just add a sub-criteria for community resilience here, and we can work on maybe defining that after this. Do people feel okay about that? Does that make sense to add it here? Thumbs up from David. Thumbs up from Abby. General people. Okay. Judy, go ahead.
I would like it to read climate resilience and adaptation. If that's what we're addressing here, then it needs to reflect that.
Up here in the criteria?
Yeah.
Are folks okay with that? Great.
If I could add one other complicating thought to this. When we think about financial feasibility, there's certainly a feasibility aspect to it in terms of like the money to make things happen. But there is an equity component to it in terms of what tools are given to what communities in financial capacity. So again, it's like straddling.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Just a clarifying question, Lauren, on the community resilience, well, and for the group too. So with the MCA, we would be asking ourselves, does this proposed strategy, what are the qualitative impacts, quantitative measures, and directionality of the strategy on community resilience as we define it?
How should I capture that here?
Well, I'm wondering, to Jake's question, our next piece of our agenda was a big idea brainstorm or an unstructured group chat. And so I'm wondering if, in the guise of going through this MCH, do we think that, would it be helpful to do another, here's an example strategy and run it through this as a part of our discussion today? Or how are people thinking that we can most beneficially help ourselves within this context? I've been taking notes from Grace Odell, who's the executive director of NOFA Vermont, who was raised as a Quaker. I'm trying to channel that. So we can just let this space exist. And
I might fill the space with my other questions.
Great.
As we keep thinking about this, if that's okay.
It's fine.
Okay. All right, let's see what else we have. How do we define soil health? And maybe there's a lot of people in this group that probably have a lot of thoughts on that. So maybe we try to break through that question today. That is an outstanding one for as shared definition we should come to agreement on. I'm sure Abby, John, Charlie, and Alyssa especially have a lot to say, but I'm sure and Ryan, basically all of us. So opening the floor to anybody who wants to throw out a definition for soil health.
Well, and to Judy's point, right, and Judy's framework, I mean, soil health could, in theory, be the definition of soil health is the ultimate definition of the entirety of our work. So no big deal, no pressure, but kind of got to get it right.
I mean, I think, from a farm point of view, there is no clear definition. I mean, there are some sort of basics. Yeah, we got to have organic matter. You've got to have oxygen. You've got to have infiltration. You've got to have microorganisms. You've got to have microbiome. You've got to have worms. You've got to have, you know, X, Y, Z. But exactly the relationship between all of those things, and of course it varies. You know, I've got on my old farm, we got Vergennes clay to Nellis stony loam. You know, so, but Ryan's got his hand up. He's probably got the perfect answer for us.
No, I certainly don't have an answer to this question. I can share there's robust discussion within the Payment for Ecosystem Services and Soil Health Working Group, and a subgroup within that working group is tackling this to, for the purposes of that group, frame the large focus, which is rebuilding Vermont's natural capital, and an evaluation that can be soil health. What I've shared in the chat is a definition that was added to the statute, to the water quality chapter of agriculture in Title VI, which is one definition that informs some of the agency's approach, and it's embedded in our rule and you know how the division looks at healthy soil. Now that's not soil health per se, but it provides a pretty generic definition that could be picked apart or what have you. But just wanted to share that one as one example of what's out there. But I think it's very interactive and lots of ways to measure it and define it.
So we have what Ryan has added from 6BSA in the chat, and Judy's comment, we need to think of soil and water as a living entity. Do we have any thoughts as to how if we used this definition as a jumping off point to get to Judy's point? Oh, Charlie, go ahead.
Sorry, thanks. Yeah, I would just throw one other kind of layer in here that we're talking about soil health, but I think a critical component here is also soil loss, or the antithesis of that, because that's another thing that, you know, healthy soil in and of itself is an important criteria here, but it seems like the loss of soil through the impacts we're talking about is also a very important layer when we think about the impacts here, because it could be healthy, but if it's going to wash away in the next storm, then it doesn't really matter.
Well, and I think that goes to Judy's point, right? If you consider soil as a living entity and water, what is required to support soil as a whole being, you know, and that would mean that you would include in that working definition or understanding of it that, yeah, that in order for it to be healthy and living and whole, it would need to not wash away in the next storm, and that would be a component of how we thought about the overall health of the soil.
Yeah, I don't know if like resilience is if we're talking about soil resist or resilience, but there's an element to that.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm just going to start reading the chat to you guys. Is that helpful? Judy's next point is healthy soil is subjective. Hard scrabble is a healthy soil because it has a distinctly different use. That is something I personally resonate with. I mean, our entire farm is quote unquote, you know, we are not a viable farm according to our soil types, and yet we are farming, so something's viable here. And so that is a factor of this as well, is what is the place for which different soils and their purposes enter into this thinking as well. Judson adds, erosion and runoff of soil would likely be captured under water quality. And Alyssa says she doesn't see a problematic overlap between soil health and air quality, and maybe add soil erosion to environment category.
I would certainly agree with adding erosion there. I mean, many of our water quality problems in Vermont have, I speculate, were caused by the clearing of much of our forests back in the early 1800s, late 17, early 1800s. And we're paying a lot of that for today on top of other activities. I'm not minimizing other activities, but that's an important point. And I think, you know, because, as Alyssa has pointed out and others, there are so many different definitions of healthy soil at this point, and it may be impossible to arrive at an overarching one. I think that I would say for now, going with Ryan's point or his definition, it covers a lot of the bases, and that's probably where we need to be.
Well, if I could, Bill, I agree with that. And I'll just add a slightly different perspective. I think part of the challenge of soil health is that it connects both, it produces a whole set of values. It helps produce the trees and the crops and the food. And so we want, and contributes in so many ways, so like water quality and this and that. So there's what it produces. There's also the risks that we face when we don't have good soil health, you know, the erosion, the flooding, the impacts. And so those things are captured in other parts in the spreadsheet, but there's value in soil health in and of itself. Just the physical characteristics of healthy soil is something that's worth trying to capture and evaluate. At least I think that's fair. And it might be that rather than try to make soil health capture all of those things in this one small line on this chart, let's make sure that as we make our recommendations, that one of our headlines should be, you know, in light of, I think Judy's really compelling chart or you know, worldview, would be to make sure we define soil health up front as one of our key outcomes. It's like a theme like equity, diversity, inclusion, a theme like that. You know, it's just an overriding theme that intersects with everything. But for the purpose of this chart, just treat it as the kind of what are the physical, biological characteristics of a healthy soil, and leave it at that.
Folks feel on board with David's suggestion in that regard? I'm seeing general thumbs up.
Hey, Abby, you hit an interesting point too with your comment about your soils on your farm and how they're described in different contexts. And you know, one of the things that we run into specifically with like the land conservation world is when we're looking at funding opportunities specifically through USDA around farmland conservation, and they look at basically any farm outside the Champlain Valley and they say it's not worth it because those soils are horrible. And we look at it and we say these are some of our best farms in the state, you know. So there's an equity component here in terms of the lens we see that and how we look at I don't want to say productivity class, but how we address that through resources to farmers and possibly policy recommendations there.
I deeply appreciate you pointing that out so that I didn't have to. It's yes, getting our farm conserved was quite a feat, which is certainly something that will need to be factored into how we recommend that the state be thinking, right, about the entirety of the breadth of what healthy soil is throughout the state and what that looks like and how that ties into all of these systems. And I think to David's point, that and Judy's in alignment with Judy's, the chart of the worldview, that really is the overarching principle as I'm starting to see it. You know, without healthy soils, you know, none of these overall goals are possible ultimately. John.
I think a point you emphasize, Abby, by pointing out that you farm on a barren wasteland, that it's all in the management. There's huge amount in the management of those soils. You can have technically poor soils, but how, you know, from NRCS's point of view, but farmer A can grow pineapples and farmer B grows stones. You know, it's all in the management. And I think that's an important point. And it's why I'm resistant to go down the line of, oh, this type of agriculture is the only one that we should support.
Yeah. I am both. Oh, Judy.
For me, the definition goes back to what I said a while back. The soil is health when the land is allowed to be used, is healthy when the land is allowed to be used for its intended purpose. So alluvial soil might have a totally different purpose than hardscrabble. And once it's allowed to be used for its intended purpose, then it becomes healthy. If you try to do on alluvial soil what you do on hardscrabble soil, it probably isn't going to work, and vice versa.
So again, I guess I would agree with that. One. Two, I guess my question would be, is that more, again, similar to the financial questions or the feasibility questions, is that a bit of a broader question as to how we would structure a proposed strategy to move through this MCA tool, or is that something that needs to somehow be captured within the MCA tool?
I would argue that it's just a really good point of recognition that when we define soil health, if we go with David's recommendation to kind of keep this within the MCA tool being the physical characteristics, I would argue then that would support Judy's recommendation that different soils have different geological complexities and therefore are used theoretically for different things. So the same parameters that you would define healthy characteristics on ag soils in your barren wasteland farm, as John called it, might look different than what you would see in Addison County. You know, so I think I would say that, Judy, this should, I think this supports what you're saying, that we're recognizing that different soils have different uses, and as long as they're being used for their intended uses, their physical characteristics will yield health.
So is this definition saying chemically balanced has a pH of 7, and if it doesn't have a pH of 7, it's not healthy soil? No, that's not what it's saying, John. What
I
is
sure hope not, because my whole
I
farm is not healthy.
Right, that's what I'm getting at. So what does chemically balanced mean in this definition?
I'm going to let Ryan answer that one.
Yeah, I mean, I looked at the Cornell Assessment of Soil Health as one regional way to evaluate the physical, chemical, and biological properties of the soil to try to understand. So those are the 3 parameters on which different soil criteria are measured on a scale. A lot of it is focused on crop productivity, and then, you know, the structure of the soils itself and the biological communities that exist therein. I think soil health is an important goal to look at and acknowledge there's many different ways to define it and measure it. And it is, I think, a good goal in of itself, but as discussed above, you could have, a very healthy soil, but you also could be managing it with nutrients that are, you're just hammering it with manure or compost and having runoff, which would degrade water quality. And so there's certainly directionality that could be present within that discussion. But I don't, if you just, the soil health as an end in of itself, I think is appropriate to elevate. We may all have our own definition of what it is and how to get there.
Just well, in support of the definition that Alyssa just posted, and also comment to that, is that the definition she posted, I think, helps speak to the task and the function of this tool, which is, again, to, I think, determine. So if we put it into terms of, does the proposed strategy help the continued capacity of soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans? That to me is a framing that sort of provides sufficient guidance for what the tool is looking to do. And again, kind of framing it as like, what we're looking to do is determine, does the how does the strategy impact or influence these criteria? And I feel like that definition gives us a framework to work with, that also enables us to deal with a lot of the nuances that are being discussed here about, well, which type of soil, that there's different kind of nuances, but that mainly what we're looking at when we're talking about this soil health is this capacity to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans, without getting overly technical about what those functions are.
So I look at this as just the opposite, right? So think of that chart and the spine of the land, all the microorganisms to the to humans work to care for the soil. So when they work to care for the soil, then the soil becomes healthy soil. So it's not that healthy soil sustains all of those things, it's that the people work to care and create a healthy soil. The microorganisms, everything.
Yeah, I think we're saying the same thing, Judy, because I think it's the question of trying to determine, the strategy that's being proposed, either directly or indirectly, like how is it changing that soil ecosystem and its ability to function as it should? Is it negative? Is it negatively impacting it? Is it positively impacting it by allowing it to be, what it wants to be? And so I think one of the keys here is like this tool is asking us to evaluate the strategy through these criteria.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what you said is compatible with that.
Yeah, it's that relationship. Everything is in relationship, and it makes it a living entity, whether it's water or soil, if there's relationship between the spine of the land.
Yeah.
Judson says, and maybe this is helpful for further clarification too, I would also echo Jake saying that the task of MCA is to identify, does the practice or the strategy improve soil health, not are your soils healthy? So I think I would agree that I think ultimately we're all coming to the same end place. The manner with which we frame it might be semantically different, but I think ultimately the outcome is the same. If I'm misinterpreting that, somebody please jump in. But I do sense that we're all pulling for the same, pulling for the same end result, even if we're framing it slightly differently. I am also, not to be that person, but I am cognizant of the time and just sort of checking in with folks and how you're feeling about where the time is at and where our discussion is at, and how we want to wrap up for today, or if we're ready to wrap up for today.
I think, yeah, we're running out of time, but I would love if Iris is willing to share what was discussed yesterday. The second page of this, there's a conversation on disinvested versus impacted communities, which I kind of captured here. And Iris, if you have anything that you're willing to share from yesterday's meeting that you think might inform this conversation or this tool, that would be helpful, since you just had the conversation yesterday, so while it's still fresh on your mind.
Yeah, do you mean with regard to the frontliner impacted communities?
Yes,
okay.
I think so. If you think that's where this would fit. So looking at the screen under the equity we talked about last time, disinvested, and then Monday at the Climate Council meeting, maybe that was last Monday, Sarika Tandon said we should use impacted and use that impacted now. And so I'm curious if there's anything further on that should be captured here as we define what impacted communities are and how we're hoping to elevate this tool to support them.
I'm not sure I have a clear answer on terminology, but
okay.
I would say that who they are is something we're trying to define. And I put in the chat a piece of a presentation that David Plum shared that we were working with to figure out what makes communities the frontliner impacted communities. And we also did bring that up, whether it was frontline versus impacted, and no one at the subcommittee level had a strong preference there. Just terminology wise, I'm not sure that I know the distinction enough to have a strong preference either. But I do think that it's important to understand what the word means and what we are like as a what we have as a common understanding for what those communities are. So yeah.
Great, thank you.
Lauren, is there anything else within your questions that you're desperately looking for clarification or answers? It looks like Ryan has to jump off, and Judy as well.
I don't think so.
Okay. My apologies to everyone for my lack of skill in meeting facilitation. I'm just wondering if anybody has any final thoughts, and then we can do public comment and wrap up for today.
Your facilitation has been wonderful. It's a big group to corral.
Thanks, Jake. Jane, if it's okay with you, I think maybe we can talk in emails about agenda formulation for next week, because I think, or if anybody has any specific thoughts, but I think a large chunk of next week will be committed to RISE and climate access and focusing on that. And I really want to just give over to that. I think that's really critical to our process at the moment. So that's my thinking at the moment, if nobody has any issue with that, takes any issue with that. And if I can get a thumbs up from everybody, we can move on to public comment. Awesome. Okay. Thank you, guys. So with that, any members of the public care to jump in at the moment? feel free to raise your hands or just jump in audibly. Okay. I think that means we did it all right, guys. There's no, just kidding. So with that, I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend. I'm off to go wrestle thorn apples more. Wish me luck.
Good luck.
Trying to not get one in my head. All right.
Thanks,
Thank
Abby.
you guys very much.
Have a nice afternoon.